You want to do Ohio State, Indiana, or Ole Miss, Florida? Captain's choice.
Let's do Ohio State, Indiana before people just think we're dunking on the SEC.
Okay. So you ready to dunk on Indiana?
Let's do it. Those freaking losers. I knew they were frauds all along. I've been telling you all season they were frauds, and boy, were they frauds out there today. Probably shouldn't be in the playoff. There should probably be we should put Florida in over the Hoosiers at this point.
I mean, if we are going to get the 12 best teams, you got it. I mean, it's the best teams, right?
By the way, just before we get into this, when you look at all the power ratings, do you know who's one of the 12 best teams in the country?
Indiana.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, they've jumped from a 2 to an 18 throughout the season. And isn't 18 up there with a 23 or a 24? No. But that's the thing that I try to remind even your, hypothetical Vegas says this, well, guess what? Vegas reacts to what they see and they change their preconceived notions based on performance. And Indiana has had their rating increased every single week.
It'll probably go down a little this week though.
Obviously. But even when they beat Michigan by 5 and kind of struggled, the strength of schedule improved because of playing Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
First Indiana coming out, getting a touchdown early.
Jim Knowles baited him. I don't know if you noticed, but Indiana comes out, and obviously scripted drives are scripted drives.
Right, scripted drives. That's what I'm saying. You came out, but well-coached team. They did exactly what they were told to do.
Yeah, they went 70 yards and scored, but Ohio State never brought pressure. They just rushed 4, and they were kind of just dropping back. They were mixing up their schemes, but they weren't, bringing anybody extra. They were sticking in basic-ass cover 3s, mans, whatever they were doing. And then from that point on, pressure from everywhere, from every angle, and they were doing an excellent job of not letting you know where it was coming from before the snap. They would wait as long as possible before they would get into it. They would overload one side. They would do all these different stunts. They would bring guys and drop other guys in the coverage. Jim Knowles was just going through the entire blitz book for most of the rest of the game. Auburn wins in 4 overtimes, but just completely confusing and overwhelming that Indiana front. Curtis Rourke was not sure where anything was coming from after the ball was snapped. He wasn't sure where to go. And it really, really flustered them, and it killed them. Ohio State scored 38 points in this game, but their defense won them this game. And I know there were the special teams miscues by Indiana. There was the muffed punt that went through the punter's hands that set them up, but that ended up in an interception. So it's not like Ohio State scored off of it. And then there was the Caleb Downs punt return, which kind of just really drove a nail through Indiana's heart. But just overall, after that first possession, the Buckeyes defense completely shut the Hoosiers down. And it went along with what I had talked about with what we saw from Indiana against Michigan. Their offense had its worst performance of the season against Michigan. And the Michigan defense that it faced, very talented, but not nearly as good overall as this Ohio State unit was. And just they completely shut them down, held them to 151 yards. Curtis Rourke was 8 of 18 for 68 yards. They averaged only 2 yards per carry on the ground. And I broke it down. I looked at the stats. Indiana's first 7 games this season, their offense averaged 4.17 points per drive, had a success rate of 55.5%, and had a 17.5% explosive rate. The last 4 games, those numbers have dropped to 2.26 points per drive, 43.3% success rate, and an 8.5 explosive rate. Against Ohio State and Michigan, 1.52 points per drive, 39.8% success rate, and 6.1% explosive rate. You can pick apart the SOS. You can talk about how much it should matter, because even against their schedule, a 10-0 record is a 5% or 95th percentile outcome, which should be rewarded. But there's also truth to the fact that they hadn't played anybody, and they don't look nearly as good once they do.
The miscues accounted for 14 points?
Mm-hmm.
Almost directly?
Mm-hmm.
That's where I think that it's, there are ways that you go in and you open up an advanced box score, and they'll give you the turnover luck, and you can kind of figure out like what would have been a fair based on success rate and EPA and all those things. Like what would have been a fair score. It was closer than 38-15, but Ohio State
Not
was
that
still,
close. Not
Ohio State.
really.
Ohio State was still the better team.
See, that's the thing. I don't think it was that much closer than 38-15 because Ohio State dominated the final 55 minutes of that football game. Indiana jumped out to that 7-0 lead, and then it was a wrap for the Hoosiers, period. They were never, even when they were still winning, it never felt like they were in the game anymore because they couldn't move the ball.
Yeah.
I mean, Will Howard was, let's see, 22-26 for 201 yards and 2 touchdowns. He didn't really run a whole lot. In fact, he finished with -1 yard. His only interception hit his receiver right in the hands. So I'm not even putting that on him. Just no, Ohio State dominated that game, man. That was not a close game. The score is about as the scores might not be accurate, but because I feel like Ohio State won by more.
Ooh, okay. All right. I'll take the other side of that. I thought that with Ellison and Lawton, they had more 4-yard gains than I would have expected. More than that Ohio State defense has allowed against a lot of teams. I thought that they gave themselves chances more often than you might have expected. That some of the routine stuff that Indiana was doing offensively against Ohio State's excellent defense, I thought that they were doing a good job, because we talk a lot about the bodies. We talk a lot about the fact that, this offensive line that isn't loaded up with blue chips, they haven't had to play a lot of teams like that. I thought that they did a good job of being able to at least create opportunities. I thought that Indiana's offense did not convert on opportunities. I thought there were some missed plays by missed throws by Rourke. I thought there were missed plays by the skill position players. And then, of course, like I said, I thought there were, the block, the return, the bumbled snap, the fumble on the sack. Like you can't set up the better team with short fields when you're the double-digit underdog playing on the road. And then the game got away from him. But I mean, I'm not giving him a moral victory here, but I do think that this was an Indiana performance where I don't think it proves anything regarding their mettle or like where they are in terms of their caliber as a team.
I don't think it should knock them out of the college football playoff if they're.
I don't know. I don't care about. We'll talk about that later. Listen, man, we got
no.
lots of
I think it pretty resoundingly proved
that they don't belong on the same conversation as Ohio State.
Because again, I will point out, Ohio State had 2 red zone possessions in which they came away with no points, and they still won by 23. And if you look at Indiana, they had the 70-yard touchdown drive to start the game. They had the 75-yard touchdown drive at the end of the game when it was already in hand, and Ohio State was once again just kind of dropping back and more worried about letting them run clock than anything else. That's 145 yards on those 2 drives. Indiana finished the game with 151 yards, Chip. Between those 2 drives, they had 6 yards. They were never in that game. Period.
Fair. But no, I'm just kidding. All right. We will get to rankings related conversations in tomorrow's top 25 a little bit later on today. Do you come away from Ohio State feeling like they passed a test then?
No.
Yeah.
I think Ohio State beat a team they're better than, which is a pretty common occurrence for them. I would actually say, too, the defense was incredible. I would love to see their defense do that every week. They don't. Like, that pass rush all season long has been there in some games and then completely disappears and then shows up. Tonight, they had 5 sacks, 8 tackles for loss. It was great to see. I'd like to see it more consistently. But the one thing I've also talked about was that offensive line. Trevion Henderson had that 39-yard run on the final possession where he slid down at the 1. And then they took 2 turns to get in, which, by the way, they needed 2 plays to sneak in with their quarterback from the 1-yard line. That's 40 rushing yards on those last plays of the game. They finished with 115. So you take away those runs, they had 75 yards on 26 carries. That is under 3 yards per carry. You can beat Indiana doing that, clearly. You've beaten a whole bunch of other bad teams doing that, clearly. Once they get to the Big Ten championship, because, I mean, barring something crazy, they're probably going to be there. I don't think you can beat Oregon averaging 2.5 yards per carry. I don't think you can win 3 playoff games averaging 2.5 yards per carry. They've got to figure that out. Doesn't mean they can't, because the more time they have with this version of their offensive line, it's realistic to expect they will improve. But if they play like they did today, they won't.
You know what Henderson's performance today made me think about? How beneficial it's been to have him and Quinshawn Judkins to be able to just share the workload, because Henderson's dealt with some injuries throughout his career. Our tread on the tires count for him heading into the college football playoff and an unprecedentedly long schedule is it's gonna have him fresher than he would have been in other seasons. So it's a good sign moving forward for sure.